I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard, or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government, and therefore become liable to the penalty the law inflicts upon such offences, such as forfeiture of life, confiscation of lands, etc., etc. And I do hereby further declare all indented servants, negroes, or others, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the speedy reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. Lord Dunmore, November 7th, 1775. So on this day, the 7th of November, in 1775, a year after the rebellion began in the 13 colonies, John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, the Governor of Virginia, offered emancipation to any slave who was willing or able to come and pick up arms in his cause, or the king's cause. Somewhere between 800 and 2,000 did, and this outraged many slave owners in Virginia at the time. Now he did say he was aiming for this to be at the patriots, as they call themselves, the rebels, and he wanted their slaves to come over to him. Unfortunately, slaves from everyone decided that this might be a good chance to achieve their freedom and get out of whatever their lives they were living. So it didn't just annoy the rebel leaders who had slaves, it also annoyed people who would have been loyalists. It caused a crack amongst the wealthy landowners in Virginia. But what is important about this is that it is the first time that an Emancipation Proclamation happened in what later became the United States. And it's the reason that somewhere up to 80,000 slaves and even some freed black men fought with the Loyalist forces against the rebels, because for them they saw the rebels as the ones that wanted to protect this institution of slavery. In 1772, so a few years before the war began, there was a case in England, Somerset case, in which an American colonist had come to England with his slave. But before leaving, his slave had fled to a group of abolitionists, and they, along with various barristers who worked for free for him, challenged his slavery. There was no law in England at the time encoding slavery, and although the judgment didn't say necessarily everyone should be free, it did say that slavery could not be enforced in England. This was seen as a big victory for the abolitionists, and was used by the abolitionists to push their cause in government and parliament. For many American slave owners, and many of them did have slaves, the rich ones, this was kind of terrifying. They could see which way the wind was blowing. They could see public opinion back in Britain was going against slavery, even though it was economically essential in many ways to the large landowners in the colonies, not just there but in the Caribbean as well. During the American War of Independence, as I said, tens of thousands of slaves ran away, rebelled, and went behind British lines and were given their freedoms. Many of them during the war were recaptured, or during the British evacuation were also captured, re-enslaved and sold again. But the ones that did take up arms with the British ended up being evacuated after the Treaty of Paris. 3,500 of them were brought to Nova Scotia. Many thousands more went to Upper Canada, which is now Ontario. Thousands more went eventually to Sierra Leone. Others went to Jamaica and other territories in the Caribbean. And even a few thousand ended up in London, some of whom became known as the Poor Blacks of London. But this was the first time this has happened. This was the first time anything like this had happened in terms of emancipating slaves. It was done to weaken the rebels. Some would say it was a cynical ploy, although Lord Dunmore, when he evacuated very soon after, he had to evacuate to New York, he brought the men who had fled to him with him because he wanted to train them better in New York. Unfortunately, on the trip, out of the 800 he took with him, only 300 managed to survive the trip to New York as smallpox broke out on the ship during the journey. So that must have sucked for them. But the 300 who did arrive, later on, the survivors would end up going to Nova Scotia and some to London. So for many of them, that was a better life than the lives they had before. This was going to be the first step, or perhaps the second if you take the Somerset case into account, in the long journey that would end up in 1807 abolishing the slave trade, and 1833 abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire, beginning the crusade against slavery during the rest of that century. So, on this day, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, John Murray, the Governor of Virginia, issued his proclamation offering freedom and emancipation to all indentured servants and slaves who came and fought with him against the rebels. If you like these videos, subscribe, like, and comment, and come back tomorrow for more.